Just like how we have various silent agreements and assumptions in the overarching strategy of a Final Fantasy XIV dungeon, such as the way we assume a pull is done, even if we don't always all agree on it. Another interesting aspect are the silent agreements and assumptions we often have in the context of a boss fight. An even more interesting angle to this, at least to me, is that due to these assumptions being slightly more abstract, there are also situations in a boss fight where we distinctly don't have a consistent silent agreement, and that is where things tend to get weird. So if you know of some silent assumption you frequently run into, or perhaps a situation where it feels like there are either two different assumptions clashing, or perhaps just no plan, I would love to hear about those situations in the comments. Now, let's talk about some silent assumptions and agreements. So, when I say silent assumptions, in a way, it often comes down to things where we just know things will be done in a certain way. An effective way to tell that there is a silent assumption about something is both that the rest of the party, largely speaking, will be approaching, say, a mechanic in a very specific way, and at the same time get very confused, if not outright aggressive at times, if a single individual impactfully veers aside from that norm. On the opposite end, you can somewhat tell that there isn't a silent assumption or norm about dealing with a specific thing when the typical response to the particular situation appearing, leading to total chaos. In some cases, you may even see individuals that try to enforce order in the chaos by, get this, using words. The audacity. But we will get to all these things in due time. Let's start with one of the most common silent agreements. Main tank stand still. This one is so commonly known that many players might just look at me like a lunatic for suggesting this is some sort of silent agreement we have. Like, do we need to agree on this? But indeed we kind of do. The reason why this silent agreement matters is twofold. The first half is that while the tank might not have any particular reason to stand so still, all 6 melee DPS jobs have attacks that do extra damage when performed from a specific angle relative to the boss, and these angles are almost impossible to consistently hit if the boss is spinning like a top or switching back and forth between 2 directions. Sure, melee DPS can overcome this to some degree with planning and true north, but there are limits, and, no need to make things harder for nothing. The second half is that bosses, and sometimes mobs in general, will have attacks that strike relative to the way the enemy is facing. So the boss spinning around could randomly lead to a healer DPS getting swiped by an attack meant for the tank, or meant to be dodged. This specific angle also leads to the additional agreement that the tank typically faces the boss away from the party, just on the off chance the boss does have some frontal cleave attack, which at the same time also naturally positions the party in such a way where the tank is the furthest away, which is often the safest approach. In certain situations, bosses can actually end up abusing this agreement by either instead or additionally having a backside cleave, which then causes the safest approach to become turning the boss sideways relative to the party, for example. Where this whole silent agreement becomes extra interesting is that the whole tank stand still thing tends to still enforce itself even when there are no melee DPS to benefit from it, and similarly, the gold standard of facing the boss away from the party has a tendency to simplify into face the boss north or some such. And when bosses then forcibly jump around or face specific directions, many players trying their best to adhere to this strict agreement run into trouble. What do you do now? Do you face the boss north again? It feels like you end up spinning the boss a lot more by that. Not that this video is meant to necessarily give guidance on what to do there, but if you heard this and thought, yeah, that's me, then my advice, real quick, is unless the specific boss encounter calls for you to face the boss a specific way, if they jump around or spin around a lot on their own, just make sure to stand in front of them so they don't also spin around based on your position on top of that. But what makes this particular silent agreement so interesting to me is that it enforces a rather strict positioning that players, once understanding it, tend to adhere to even when it isn't necessary at all, just in case. With randoms in your party, it is also a lot more likely that individuals may stop and comment on it if you, say, start spinning the boss, even if there are no melees and there are no cleaves to worry about. The next silent assumption is still in the tanking environment, but is more directed at content with more than one tank, and sort of combines two different things. The first one is pretty simple, yet not, and boils down to the somewhat commonly accepted assumption that whichever tank puts on their stance first is the one who's tanking first in casual content. What makes this silent assumption more nuanced is that to many, the act of turning on the stance is more an indication of willingness to main tank. There's also the extra additional angle to this one that, simply put, not everyone agrees with this silent assumption, and instead swear by the slightly more competitive, if you can beat me in enmity, you get to main tank, which mostly works out safely when one of the tanks is significantly superior to the other, or others in the case of alliance raids, as when there isn't a clear winner, you instead get these weird boss spinning contests where multiple tanks are trying to take the lead. That said, regardless of which of these silent assumptions you swear by, I'm sure you're more universally in agreement with the second part, which is using Provoke when there are multiple tanks out of turn is considered rude. This is partly due to the prior silent agreements, almost regardless of which one you might swear by. If you prefer the whoever stands up first is tanking first style, then Provoke tends to come up in the context of the other tank disagreeing with that or just changing their mind. It effectively gives off a kind of my turn kind of energy. In the context of the other agreement, if you can beat me, you win, Provoking is essentially a kind of cheating in that silent contest. This fact that provoking is somehow considered rude to your fellow player sometimes causes problems in duties where a provoke could save another player, as their silent agreement that we don't provoke out of turn means that a lot of players are afraid of using provoke because they don't know for sure if this is the time. What I could call the funniest example of this is in cases where you can see the main tank slowly dying, or that it is obvious to everyone that the tank will die to a tank buster in a moment, and the other tank just lets it happen rather than provoking, because that would be rude. Granted, most casual duties simply don't have attacks that require a tank switch under any circumstances, so many tanks simply don't expect it, but it is still quite funny when it is so obvious that a provoke would have helped, and it just doesn't happen. In extension of this example of a silent assumption and agreement that something is rude to do, causing players to avoid certain actions even when they could help, also extends to two other somewhat common examples. The first one is rescue. What makes this one very peculiar is that, to my knowledge, most players are very indifferent towards the usage of rescue and simply find it a mild inconvenience if rescue happens to be used incorrectly or outright poorly. But there is a large enough quantity of players that believe the use of rescue, regardless of whether it was helpful or not, is rude in and of itself, if the rescue was not specifically requested by the recipient. It sort of makes sense if we look a little deeper, as these players may interpret being rescued as the person doing so suggesting they don't know how to do the fight. Which, well, you could probably see how that could be interpreted as rude. What is funny about that is that the rescue in that case, if it helped, wouldn't be the suggestion they don't know, but rather the observation that they don't know, as without the rescue they would have been hit, right? Another way this rude interpretation comes about is that these players feel the rescue takes away agency. Whether these feelings are justified or not is not something I'm going to comment on, but the fact some players feel this way leads to a surprisingly silent agreement among a lot of players to simply not use rescue at all, just in case. The other example is in regards to limit breaks, and sort of also betrays a severe lack of agreement in when a specific limit break should be used. Usually, we all agree that when the boss is going close to death, melee limit break should be used. In fact, if it doesn't get used quickly in that rather specific time frame, a ranged or mage using it instead tends to be considered reasonable. However, a healer, or especially a tank using limit break when it might not have been necessary, seems to be more likely to be met with confusion or outright anger. Some players even insist that using a ranged or mage limit break on an AoE pull in a dungeon is bad, because of how deeply ingrained in some players it is that the limit break is saved for finishing off a boss. I am again perfectly aware that it is a rather select group of players that feel that way, but it does seem to have the effect of causing a silent assumption that even if a different limit break would help a lot in a given situation, players are much less likely to make use of the limit break on the off chance that other players in the party don't agree with that usage. It is a surprisingly hotly debated topic, enough so that I have dedicated multiple Mythbuster videos to discuss this exact subject and shine a light on how effective it is at other things than just melee limit break, so we can all be better at viewing the use of a limit break as outright helpful rather than rude. Moving back to silent agreements we actually seem to agree on, we have stack markers go in melee range, otherwise you're left to die. I find this one very funny because most of us can see the justification for it. If you're a mage of some sort and you're hanging out in Narnia somewhere with Aslan and a stack marker appears on you, your main justification to stand your ground is that you have to stop casting to move into melee range, so you will do less damage. Meanwhile, the tanks and LA melee DPS that may be around would have to exit melee range to come to you if you don't come to them, which means they will do less damage if you don't move it. So without even exchanging a word, we can probably all realize that the one with the stack marker is the one that needs help, so they have to move, and in most casual duty cases, simply moving the stack marker close to the boss solves the problem for everyone. Which leads us to the last example of silent assumptions that I regularly meet, before we move on to some funny examples of what we clearly don't have some agreement or assumptions about. In harder, more coordinated content, notably, typically through Party Finder, a common assumption is that when coordinating positions, the so-called Healer 1 is the pure healer, while Healer 2 is the barrier healer. This doesn't really do anything practically in an encounter, with the sole exception that if a party assumes everyone knows their spots automatically, that it is implied which healer goes where. If the pure healer assumes they are healer 2 wordlessly, or the barrier healer assumes they are healer 1 wordlessly, then that can add a lot of confusion. Of course, until the misunderstanding is resolved. Similarly, a funny one I frequently observe on stream is the silent assumption that the first ranged or ranged 1 or D3 is the ranged physical, while the second ranged or ranged 2 or D4 is the mage. I run into this frequently because I'm ranged 1 and a black mage in my savage rating static. Additionally, our M1 is a red mage, so enjoy that. Again, it doesn't really cause any major issues beyond mild confusion until it is rectified and everyone is on the same page. But isn't it funny how many of us end up just assuming these things? It helps with getting to the point faster, of course. So, to contrast some of these silent assumptions and agreements we often have in a boss fight context, I would like to highlight a few examples of things in a boss fight where we typically don't have a consistent silent agreement. One part is, of course, that there is not necessarily a logical, clear conclusion to draw like in the case of stack markers, but there are definitely cases where there could be, like in the case of the Savage Party Finder slots. The first example is the chaos that tends to ensue when everyone is targeted by spread markers in a casual context. Sometimes we all just so happen to run in different directions and it solves itself. Other times, some players have to run in multiple directions to finally resolve it. And yet other times, 2 or more players will be fleeing in the same direction, and well, they might just continue running, hoping that eventually the other player will stop or turn around. And while it sometimes works, other times, well, both die. And you wonder why many Savage boss strategies have super strict positions for everyone for something like spread markers. The funniest exception to this that I see is that Black Mages and more recently Pictomancers can way more frequently than other jobs get away with simply standing their ground. And most players recognize the silent agreement that these jobs really want to stand still, which strangely sometimes simply by us agreeing to let certain jobs stand their ground can make a mechanic easier. In a similar fashion, we often can assume melee jobs are likely to not run as far as a ranged job. Another example, which could also simply highlight it as a lack of trust between strangers, is soaking mechanics. Like, if a pillar requires a player to stand in it, if there are players to go around, it isn't unlikely to see 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 players in a tower that requires 1. Because none of them trust the others to stay either. And that leads me to the final example of something where, hilariously, we just can't quite agree on a consistent solution. A player dies. You have 2 healers. Who raises them? Whoever uses Swiftcast first, of course. But who uses Swiftcast first? Even in structured parties, you often need to determine before the fight begins who raises first to make sure there isn't an overlap of swift casts. So it probably comes as no surprise that this one is simply an unsolvable problem in casual fights. A very common method some players use to try and fix it is to use a macro to announce that they will do it. And the problem is that this announcement is accompanied by the use of Swiftcast, and if the other healer happens to press their Swiftcast in that same moment, then we accomplished nothing. And the only time you can be absolutely sure your co-healer isn't going to try and raise someone before you is if you already saw them use Swiftcast in the last 40 seconds, or if they genuinely don't have the MP to do it. Unless it's a white mage, in which case they might just use thin air. How would you solve that? Or perhaps any other case of a lack of a silent agreement, I guess. Sometimes there's a very logical solution to it, like inventing a special priority of which jobs that raise first and things like that. But a lot of the time, because it sort of requires everyone to be able to reason their way to that conclusion for a silent agreement to take shape reliably, it rarely ever works. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts about this subject in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact: sometimes a large number of players silently assume we have a silent agreement on things, and often it makes sense when you think about it. But sometimes it just isn't happening. A really funny example of that is Cerberus from World of Darkness, where A takes ads, B takes the belly, and C takes the chains, and that sometimes works. This actually expands to most alliance raids, as many players commonly assume A goes left, C goes right, and B stays middle, and a lot of the time, some players also assume that B tank takes the boss, but that's not always the case, is it?